Welcome to everyone migrating in from the waiting room. We're so happy to have everyone here on April 15th, Tax Day, um, but to talk about an important topic. We're so happy to have Dr. Cynthia Miller-Idriss with us today to talk about the connections between misogyny and violent extremism. We have live captioning that's available, and Noah is going to put that link in for you. And we also have CMIE accreditation. So if you want to claim CMIE credit, please do so with these QR codes. There's also an evaluation that needs to be completed in order to claim the credit. Um, for reference, we're using the Q&A function today for questions. So please submit questions along the way, and Dr. Miller-Idriss will have some time at the end to answer questions. And it's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Cynthia Miller-Idriss. She is an award-winning author and a scholar of extremism and radicalization. She's the founding director of the Polarization and Extremism Research and Innovation Lab, or PERIL, at the American University in Washington, D.C., where she's talking to us, from which she's talking to us today. She's also a professor in the School of Public Affairs and in the School of Education. Dr. Miller-Idriss regularly testifies before the U.S. Congress or briefs policy, security, education, and intelligence agencies in the U.S., the United Nations, and other countries on trends in domestic violent extremism and strategies for prevention and disengagement. Dr. Miller-Idriss has published several books, including her latest, Man Up, The New Misogyny and the Rise of Violent Extremism. In addition to her academic work, Dr. Miller-Idriss frequently writes for mainstream audiences, both as an opinion columnist for MSNBC and in publications, and there are many, such as the New York Times, The Atlantic, Foreign Affairs, The Washington Post, The Guardian, and many more. She appears regularly in the media as an expert source and political commentator on CNN, on NPR's Morning Edition and All Things Considered, which is where I encountered her first, and on NBC and ABC as well as CBS, and BBC, French, German, and Arabic World Television. So without further ado, I will turn this over to Dr. Cynthia Miller-Idriss. We're so happy that you could be with us here today in the Gender Equity Education series.
Thank you so much, Dr. Doherty, and everyone for being here. I'm really happy to be in this conversation. I'm just going to share my slides so that we can get to. Here we go. See if that works. Hopefully, yes. Okay, good. Great. So thank you for having me, and I'm delighted to be here. I have been thinking and writing about issues of violence and extremism and youth radicalization for 25 years. The first 15 years I was in Germany, where I studied school-based responses to resurgent hate and extremism. And really in those books that came out of those projects, spent most of my career interviewing and doing focus groups with men and boys, young men who had been in and around violent scenes. And I interviewed them a lot about issues of belonging and brotherhood and sort of aspects of masculinity that relate to loyalty or being a part of a group that you felt like you would never have to walk alone, but also the sort of imperative to be violent in some of those groups. But I never really, sorry, making sure that it advances here. I never really asked them or thought about asking them about how they treated women, how they viewed LGBTQ folks, like how they, what their own experiences with gender-based bullying were, gender policing, homophobic bullying. So I opened the book in a way with an apology to the field, that it took me so long to come to this myself. It is my seventh book. And after years of writing about all around the margins of gender and speaking on panels about gender and publishing occasional articles about gendered issues, I wasn't doing this. And part of why I was hesitant to do it is because I didn't consider myself, and still don't really, a scholar of gender. So I felt like maybe I'm not legitimate enough to do this. There's plenty of people working on these issues in the field. There are a lot of Black feminists who've been saying the same things. There are a lot of junior scholars who've been working on issues of misogyny. But I got more and more irritated. And what I found is that the longer I was in meetings, spending time in DC, I get asked to brief, to testify, to be in meetings, to go to the White House. I mean, under the previous administration, quite a lot. And it was very rare that issues of gender came up, even though, as I learned over time, misogyny and other forms of gender-based harm are very connected to trajectories toward violence and mass violence, including school shootings, workplace shootings, and others. So I eventually came to, kept seeing it, couldn't stop seeing it, and just became more and more irritated, essentially, at what was a false separation between national security issues and interpersonal violence. We separate these things in our agencies. So Department of Homeland Security, until this administration, also handled prevention of terrorism and targeted violence. That office has been eliminated, but in theory is still responsible on the national security side for counterterrorism and prevention. And the Department of Justice handles interpersonal violence, domestic intimate partner violence as a local law enforcement issue, even though both of those types of things, as I came to learn, are underpinned by a lot of misogyny, gender policing, and gender-based violence in both. And so I eventually came to see this as an invisibility that wasn't being addressed in the field. And so that, and in fact, came to see it as what the Biden administration described as all other extremism. So you won't be able to see this in great detail, but I'm going to highlight just this one little section. This is the classification system that the Biden administration released. This is sort of what tipped the scales for me to write the book, was they released this new classification system for domestic violent extremism that, for good reasons, tried to get away from the idea of far right or far left violence. And so they created a column of all the types of extremisms that are sort of issues or ideology based in terms of identity. So what they called racially and ethnically motivated violent extremism, which is mostly white supremacy motivated, but also animal rights, environmental extremism, and all abortion related extremisms are in one column. Then there's a whole column of anti-government extremisms, which include both sovereign citizens and anarchists. So you kind of, again, get across the spectrum, anything motivated by anti-government extremism. But setting up the classification in that way meant that there was this other huge category called all other extremisms, all other terrorisms. And that includes all extremisms motivated by personal grievance or issues related to gender, sexual orientation, sexuality, or religion, which that category of all other turns out to be the majority, the vast majority of targeted violence and terrorism activities, including the 2.6 plots that are broken up a day right now by the FBI. So there's a lot of stuff that happens that's broken up, and this is where most of it sits. But because it's in all other, you don't see hearings on it. You don't see the same kind of resources devoted to it. And that really eventually made me very irritated because, as I came to learn, in a way that shocked me, because I had never in all the years of testifying, of spending time in meetings with policymakers, with advisors on who work on national security, I'd never heard this first statistic until I started writing this book. But it is 60% in the US since 1949, 60% of mass violent attackers have a prior documented history on the criminal side of domestic and intimate partner violence. That's in a world where over half of domestic intimate partner violence goes unreported in the US, and it doesn't include things like stalking or harassment or online misogyny or revenge porn or a wide sexual assault, even a wide variety of other things that might not fall under that criminal record. And so we have a major predictor right there that I'd never heard mentioned in any room I was ever in. And so the blind spots, were kind of shocking. We also have been in a world where we have rising domestic violent extremism, including these interruption of plots and including on the male supremacist side, which I'll talk about, especially violent incels, which you may know something about if you watch the Netflix documentary or the Netflix show Adolescence, or the Louis Theroux documentary on the manosphere. We also have increasing engagement among women, and there is a well-documented and legitimate crisis in boys' and men's well-being that is creating vulnerabilities that create pathways to these sorts of things. So loneliness, isolation, disengagement. We have now 1 in 7 young men in their 20s who are called NEETs, which are never in employment, education, or training. So they're kind of living at home. I mean, that's a larger percentage of young men than we have ever had in the past. Um, just spending on average 7 hours a day online or gaming. There has been a moral panic of sorts on LGBTQ issues, particularly through the erasure of legislation and attacks on gender affirming care, as you know, amidst rising anti-trans violence, and yet gender gets relegated literally to other. And so the book's argument is that gender and misogyny are foundational to extremism and its violent outcomes, and that we have to think of it that way if we're really going to understand the prevention side of things, which is where I spend most of my time. So I just want to give you a visual of some of these examples of shootings that you have heard of that you might not realize had a gendered dimension. So some of these, like the Pulse nightclub, you will know had a gendered or anti-LGBTQ dimension, or the Tallahassee, Florida yoga studio, or the Santa Monica sorority, which were targeted attacks against women as part of violent and misogynist incel movements. But others, like Virginia Tech or the Parkland, Florida high school shooting, for example, have never been discussed in wide public media attention or among the public as having any kind of gendered dimension to them, even though, for example, the Parkland, Florida high school shooter, before he went into the school, praised the incel shooter who had attacked the Santa Barbara sorority several years ago. So that person, I never named the shooters, by the way, but that person became a sort of infamous character in the incel scene and is often referred to by his initials, ER, in phrases like, I'm going to go ER, like go attack a group of women. And so the Parkland, Florida high school shooter said that, praised him, but then did not target only women in the school shooting. And so as a result, it didn't get declared or discussed or named or even analyzed in any ways having a gendered component. Same thing with an Annapolis, Maryland newsroom shooting that got sort of described or written off as a workplace shooting by an unstable person with mental health issues. That person had also been harassing and stalking high school classmates in the past. The Uvalde, Texas elementary school shooting, where he targeted in a horrific way an elementary school with little kids, had previously been making rape and kidnapping threats against teenage girls online that was so severe that a journalist noticed it and asked them why they hadn't reported it. And when they were asked that, they said, it's report it, like it's just how online is. Like the normalization of that kind of behavior directed toward women or young women or girls online is just ubiquitous, and what some women have described as part of the cost of doing business online. The Charleston, South Carolina church shooting, and this is where we got to start to see some of the intersectionality of these issues too, where you saw an African-American community, peaceful worshipers being targeted. And I'm going to have to say something very offensive in order to quote him here, but as he was enacting that shooting that killed 9 people during a Bible study session, he said, "I'm doing this because y'all are raping our women." Right? So he's using false crime statistics that are commonly depicted within the white supremacist scene as, a need to protect women, white women, from supposedly more criminal or hypersexual men in racial and ethnic minorities and immigrants. So he was using false crime statistics that he encountered while Googling for crime, for a phrase called black on white crime, and that led him to a white supremacist website. So there are many layers here of how the algorithms contributed to that, but also how the algorithms led him to false crime statistics that led him to attack racial and ethnic minorities. That was rightly declared a white supremacist crime. It is a white supremacist terrorist attack. And the gender dimension of that was completely ignored. And so this narrative about the need to so-called protect white women from supposedly hypersexual or dangerous men who are racial and ethnic minorities is a narrative that persists in the white supremacist community and could be a place to interrupt, intervene, prevent, and engage on kind of manipulation, propaganda, and false claims. But the gendered part got sort of ignored. So you see the point here. All of these cases are cases where, in some cases where it's very clear because the targets were women, in other cases where the targets are not women, the gender dimensions are ignored. This is true internationally as well, where we have seen the same kinds of things in Norway, in Canada, Germany, Sweden, Australia, New Zealand. So prominent attacks like the attack on mosques in New Zealand several years ago on March 15th. In his manifesto, he issued a statement that said something calling on men to be real men again, right? This kind of call to a certain kind of masculinity, hyper-masculinity was there as well. And then an obsessive focus in all of these cases with white birth rates, with the control of women's reproductive rights, and with demographic change. And so this idea of the Great Replacement conspiracy theory, which has motivated a number of these white supremacist crimes, are also very closely linked to anti-feminist conspiracy theories and claims about the need to control reproductive rights, especially for white women, among white supremacists. This is true of when we talk about incels, the involuntary celibates, which I'll talk about when I review the chapters here just a little bit, but the numbers of participants on English language incel sites that are in other countries that are not predominantly English speaking is quite high. So this is a global phenomenon that has global repercussions, both for violence and for changing attitudes, as I'll talk in a minute about gender equity and democracy. So I want to just say, and I point this out in the book, that we actually know this connection exists and it's pretty well documented. There's at least a dozen reports from the UN Counterterrorism Office and the International Criminal Court documenting the relationship between gendered exploitation, sexual exploitation and violence, and gendered-based violence when it comes to Islamist actors, right? So that the connection between those things as strategic, operational, and financial motives of terrorist groups is very clear. And you will have heard these. They've made large public campaign attention levels, like the Nigerian schoolgirls or the Yazidi women's plight. The fact that al-Shabaab uses forced marriage as a tactic of territorial control, or the sexual violence perpetrated by Hamas on October 7th. These things have made large-scale international attention and are well attended to. But the fact that the same kinds of things are happening at the hands of white supremacist groups who are running prostitution rings is much less talked about or discussed. And so I'll get to that in a few minutes. And so there's a kind of there's a whitewashing of this a little bit when it comes to issues of domestic extremism and mass violence, even though we know the connection is there for these other cases internationally when it comes to terrorists overseas. So in the book, I document, what I tried to do was take a look at the whole sweeping set of ways that gender and misogyny mobilize extremism and violent outcomes. And around now, I'm sort of surprised I didn't do it already. I usually try to do it in the beginning. I should tell you that the way I define misogyny, I think, is really important here. So I don't define it in its colloquial usage, which is the hatred of women. I use the definition that Kate Mann, the philosopher, has put forward, which says that misogyny is the law enforcement arm of the patriarchy. So if patriarchies are a system of power distribution that unevenly distributes power generally between men and women, and particularly between some kinds of men over other kinds of men and women. It's upheld by two pillars. One is sexism, which is a set of attitudes, and the other is misogyny, which is a set of actions. And misogynistic policing or gender policing, I think, is really important to understand as a set of behaviors and actions like belittling, demeaning, but also harassment, stalking, and violence. All of those types of things are ways of policing gendered norms, expectations, and behavior. The reason why I think it's really important to use that definition in this case in particular is because it means that women do it as well as men. It gives the possibility for women to do it as well as men. It's not just hatred of women. I mean, women can hate other women, I guess, but it's too simple a definition of misogyny to say this is about hatred. This is not about hatred. I think this is about policing of gendered norms and expectations in ways that uphold the systems of power. And so it means that women do it as well as men. It also means that men and boys are affected, not just girls and women, particularly through homophobic bullying. So the kind of bullying that boys and men have told me about in interviews for decades, about the parts of themselves that they have to slice off to survive the homophobic bullying of other boys, manning up, right, as the title of the book, but also not crying and being called sissy or worse, right? The kind of constant policing and the messages that boys get very early on in research, as young as preschool, about what's acceptable and not, even in terms of your presentation of gendered norms like longer hair or wearing nail polish, or a dress or a skirt, right? So all of these things become very quickly policed, and that is one of the kind of vulnerabilities that I talk about later in the book. So when you look at misogyny that way, these are 5 ways that gender and misogyny can mobilize extremism and underpin it. So one is containment. That's the one I'm going to talk about the most today, and walk you through it. But very briefly, I'll review the other 4, which are punishment, exploitation, erasure, and enabling. And then I do conclude the book, thankfully, I think for all of us and for society as a whole. I think it's really important to not just diagnose the problem, but talk about solutions. So I will make sure to get to that today too, because it does leave us with a little more hope, I think. So containment is the most common and most everyday strategy, the misogynistic strategy that I believe and argue opens up pathways to some of these more harmful and violence mobilization beliefs and activities. And it began for me with an analysis of my own hate mail, that I started to notice a pattern around the time, and this may be mirrored for you. So if it's on my screen, it's the lower right-hand corner, where he says, "Why are you trans people always front and center on the news?" I will just say there's a couple things in here that are not true, but I'm often attributed either being Jewish or trans, right? There's additional sorts of things in here that you'll see. But this is after I appeared on CNN to talk about the attack on Nancy Pelosi's husband. Right away, a voicemail dinged into my work voicemail line that was this man who turned out to call from his work number, by the way, and he's a police officer, which, I mean, there are many layers of interesting things about him, but he called and he sort of went on a rant about, why are you trans people always front and center on the news, and just really angry about it, about me taking up space on camera, front and center. And that I just got really interested in that. I was like, why is he upset? His chief complaint was that I was front and center. Another thing that was interesting about him is that he hung up the phone then, and then he called back 10 minutes later and left a second voicemail after he'd done a little Googling, apparently, and decided to correct his trans hate with a regular misogynistic message, which started out by saying, looks like I might have been wrong, and then got much more sexualized, but still had this sort of chief complaint that I was on camera. I was front and center in the news. So we keep a folder of hate messages in the research lab that I run, at the request of our security team, in case there's sort of like repeat callers. And so I decided to go back through it and just see, like, is this common? And it turns out I had never noticed this before, but almost every piece of hate mail is kinetic in some way. It almost always involves motion. They want me to go back to the shithole you came out from under, crawl back under a rock, jump off a building, stay in the shadows, go back to Russia, go rub your hands together elsewhere, which is this also anti-Semitic mention, a reference. And this guy on the lower left hand on my screen says, very politely too, like, I'm asking you to get out, but didn't actually say, he put it in all caps. He didn't tell me like where he wants me to go or what I'm supposed to do. Just get out, right? Get out of sight, get out of view. And I think, Zach in the upper left-hand corner said, wrote and complained about a bunch of stuff and then says, you will never have control. And I think that's ultimately what this is about. It's about containment, about keeping someone in their place who is not meant to be front and center. And I started thinking about these other metaphors we see, like lock her up or send them back or get back in the kitchen or get back in the closet, right? All these metaphors of containment that are constantly a part of kind of our political culture and polarization itself. And I also analyze here a lot of slurs and gendered slurs in this chapter that are forms of containment, from something like quiet piggy said by an elected official to the sort of constant dehumanizing language around the word bitch, for example. And just grab the bitch was the phrase that was used to, or the tyrant bitch, referring to the Michigan governor in that kidnapping plot. And so, remembering that a lot of these animal slurs are meant to contain, to keep people smaller, to dehumanize them, to delegitimize them. And ultimately, these create pathways, as I argue, to other forms of harm that I'll talk about in just a minute. but also in this chapter, around that moment, I talk a little bit about why someone might be vulnerable to what comes next, which is influencer propaganda, as I talk about in the book, and how you could be in a culture that's swimming with these kinds of metaphors of containment, what might create fertile ground for some of the things to happen later. And some of that is the vulnerabilities piece. And I think it's really important to remember that boys and men are not only the predominant perpetrators of violence, including mass violence, they're also victims of that same violence at the hands of other boys and men. And so patterns of domestic abuse and bullying and street fighting and other forms of harms that come at the hands of other boys and men are so common, particularly in the interviews that I do with boys and men when they talk about the violence and their fear of violence, the pressure they feel to be ready to be violent. We also know that there are real ways that boys and men are struggling that have added vulnerabilities to these pathways that reduce gender equity in the long run. And so one thing I think is important to say is that the data on loneliness is not just that men are lonely. I mean, women are lonely also. We are all lonelier than previous generations. It's something we all need to work on and talk about. But so I think it's like a 1% difference in the most recent data I've seen, and it's not great. It's like 53 and 52% men versus women say they are lonely. Some are all of the time, but men's loneliness and young men's loneliness in particular is weaponized. And it is a part of a kind of culture online from influencers that's called by researchers instructed victimhood, which I really like that phrase. It's this idea that your loneliness is because of feminists or transactional women or women who refuse to date you or women who are devious or lie or will cheat on you or can't be trusted. I mean, there are just so many different grievances online that are used as, as ways of scapegoating someone to as responsible for the suffering, the real suffering that you may feel. That's also true for data on depression and anxiety. We know that men in the US have 3/4 of the deaths of despair, which are suicides, overdoses, and alcohol-fueled deaths, and that men are more affected by changing labor and wage loss patterns as traditionally male jobs have been replaced with automation or been sent overseas. That isn't to say, of course, that women don't suffer, more. I mean, there's still a gender equity gap, and there's women experience more of the violence. But this is a way of talking about some of the wellness challenges that relate to the ways that young men are in, are socialized toward a reactionary stance toward women and feminism in ways that can ultimately lead toward violence. And the way I would describe this is like there's no reason why a crisis of manhood or masculinity should have become a crisis of misogyny, but it did because that's how online worlds work, because of this instructed victimhood, because of the weaponization, because of the scapegoating that is so omnipresent in young men's worlds in particular. And so one of the things we're seeing out of that is data. You may have seen the recent Ipsos data that came out even after I made these slides just a couple of weeks ago, now says that 34% across 29 studies, 34% of Gen Z men say that agree or highly agree with the statement that men should always have the final say in household decisions and a wife should always listen to her husband. That's compared to 16% of boomer men. So it's more than double now, Gen Z men, and that's gone up over the last few years. It's also 18% of Gen Z women compared to 6% of boomer women. So it's tripled for women who agree with those two statements. And so overall, we have Gen Z men who are less likely than older men to say they're feminist or support women's rights. And there's an increasing gender divide on women's rights between young men and young women, and overall a declining level of support among young men compared to older men for those rights. And so it's not moving along in the direction it typically does in terms of support for equity and rights is sort of reversing course for this generation. The ways I think that happens, there are many ways it happens, but there are three pathways that I articulate in this chapter. Online gaming, which I want to just say it's not the games themselves that are a problem. There's really very little research that the narrative components of games or even their violence embedded in them has anything to do with actual violence in the real world. But there is really good emerging evidence on what happens in those in-game chats, the live chat feature that are kind of toxic stews of misogyny, of homophobic bullying, of racism, are really kind of incubators for harmful ideas that normalize and mainstream. The second is memes and short form videos, which is just a way of embedding a lot of racist, misogynist, and other harmful ideas in jokes, and into really aesthetically pleasing kinds of images. I mean, I often say it's like typically like a blonde woman walking through like a field of wheat with, or in the woods with the deer and little dappled light. It's a very aesthetically pleasing, but then there's a layer of messages like this that are racist or misogynistic or encouraging women to give up, be submissive, be happier. So I'm happy to talk about that later. But the one that I worry about the most, to be honest, and where we spend a lot of time in the lab is on the self-help forums and the self-help pathway. So research is consistently showing that one of the fastest pathways to these kinds of harmful ideas about dominance, aggression, about the use of violence against women as a way of maintaining dominance and aggression are through self-help searches on the part of teenage boys who are looking for help typically with three things: how to get rich, how to get bigger. And so there's a lot of fitness searching, and how to get a girlfriend. So it's dating, finance, and fitness are the three main pathways. Within minutes of a sock puppet account, so researchers have found, anywhere from 4 minutes to 27 minutes is what I've seen in various studies, but very consistently within minutes of a 13 to 16-year-old boy's new account being set up, he receives, just by searching for sports or fitness or cars, typically, or dating advice, anything that codes him as a boy according to the algorithm. He gets manosphere content like Andrew Tate, like this influencer who advocates for exploiting women for sale and also physically harming them as a mechanism of control. Has a 20% approval rating among American teenage boys, by the way. I mean, he has been very popular, even though some of those boys say, yes, he's problematic, but he's got a point. And so you very quickly get to that content just by searching. So the algorithms deliver it, even if you don't look for it. If you hover over one of those videos, you get more of them, of course. And if you watch one all the way through, within 2 to 3 hours, the majority of the feed is full of that kind of content. I will note that it's not much better for girls. Sock puppet accounts for girls show that within 2.5 minutes, teenage girls are getting self-harm or pro-anorexia content. So they're also getting very harmful content that's directed to them based on makeup tutorial searches or searches on how to lose weight. And so but the content that the girls receive is self-harm directed, whereas the content the boys receive is often harm directed toward girls. And so it's a big part of where we spend our time in the lab right now, and I'm happy to talk about that later. I just want to very briefly review what the other chapters do so that you have a sense of it. When I'm talking about punishment here, we're talking about the core of what the one part that the field of national security has sort of belatedly come to see as part of the problem of violent extremism. It's not officially noticed in the U.S. It's not officially classified anywhere in the U.S. government, but it is in Canada and the U.K. and in Australia. This idea that violent incels, misogynist incels, which all came out of and emerged from a much longer trajectory of what's known as the manosphere, the men's rights movements in the 70s, and then eventually pickup artists and eventually violent incels, have all contributed. Those are now seen, at least among scholars, as part of the spectrum of violent extremism, even if they're not normally recognized by policymakers in the US. Here you see a lot of anti-feminism and anti-rights language. In the exploitation chapter, which was the hardest one for me to write, because I, as I said, did not know any of this, even though I'd been in the field for a long time. This was all new information for me, really disturbing to find out about the sex trafficking at the hands of white supremacist groups. I will just say one thing about this. This covers child exploitation, domestic intimate partner violence, AI and VR generated sexual violence, including synthetic media. to argue that gender-based violence is both spontaneous and a systematic part of extremism, and that we have to understand it as operationally and intentionally useful to some of these groups. So, one of the things I learned is that white supremacist groups, when they're groups like the Aryan Brotherhood or its offshoots or neo-Nazi groups, are almost always broken up on three charges in the US. It's racketeering charges, weapons trafficking, and drugs trafficking. But the Drug Enforcement Administration in the US has said that essentially where there is drug trafficking, there is sex trafficking. There's something like a 97% overlap between those two sets of crimes. But you rarely see, almost never, I've never seen the charges for sex trafficking when you see those other charges. So I went through the affidavits in one of the cases where a neo-Nazi group was broken up on these other charges. And in the affidavits, you'll see detail. And again, I'm a trigger warning for about to say something really horrific, but that one of the men in the neo-Nazi group was described as having kept women for sale at his house, assaults, the footage was sold on the dark web in order to finance their racist operations, right? So strategic financial exploitation, no charges filed on the sex trafficking, only on the drug racketeering and weapons trafficking. And in Los Angeles, where 63 neo-Nazis were arrested a few years ago, same trio of charges. And the AP coverage of it, which is probably the most infuriating thing that I read the entire time in this preparation for this book, the AP coverage had one line that said, the hostage negotiation team was also on hand to assist. And I thought, like, well, who do you think the hostages are? We know that where there's drug trafficking, there's sex trafficking. We know they've been arrested on these charges. And we know that there are cases in Europe and elsewhere where neo-Nazis and white supremacist groups have been arrested for running prostitution rings. So I've been talking to, the solution on that is not as hard as you think. It's there could be an enhancement charge to have local law enforcement pay attention to those crimes so that we could at least get the data on it. But there are, of course, challenges to making sure the victims are protected, are safe, and that they're not harmed through having charges filed that might require them to testify. Erasure is a chapter that talks about the erasure and control of bodies, bans on gender-affirming care, transgender rights, but also knowledge, attacks on gender studies, librarians, school boards, curriculum. We're seeing that in universities, as you probably know, across the country, but also in elementary school and middle school as well, and particularly in states like Florida and Texas, but in lots of other places. So I'd love to know how that's affecting you as in the medical school as well. I also link that to some of the violent outcomes we've seen around the Proud Boys harassing, neo-Nazis harassing at drag story hours or outside of Disney in protests supposedly of pedophiles in Disney who are protecting, because Disney protested some of the LGBTQ action and anti-LGBTQ actions in Florida. And then finally, I wanted to say something about enabling. So this chapter is about the role of white women in particular in supporting, enabling, and also mobilizing violent outcomes within the white supremacist scene, but also in misogynistic ways. Here, I look at, I open it with a sort of arc of looking at Vicki Weaver and Ashley Babbitt. So Vicki Weaver was a white supremacist mother who was killed at the siege at Ruby Ridge in 1992. When she was shot through a door by a stray bullet from a federal law enforcement officer while she was holding her baby. And so she became an immediate martyr for the movement. Her son was also killed, her 14-year-old son, while they were trying to arrest her husband, Randy Weaver. The family won a wrongful death suit, multi-million-dollar wrongful death suit against the U.S. government, which reinforced the martyrdom of Vicki Weaver and her son. So she still adorns kind of posters and flags and scenes, memes that say things like "Your family could be next," her face. But she was, wearing like a sundress, peaceful, standing behind a door, was a homeschooling mother who sold berries, at a farmer's market to support the family, like very aligned with the domestic nature of women in the white supremacist scene. And then you fast forward 30 years later, and Ashley Babbitt was also killed through a door by a law enforcement bullet. But this time she was trying to break one down at the US Capitol on January 6th. Ashley Babbitt's not a mother. She's a veteran was mobilized through QAnon and conspiracy theories to anti-government action in that case, and was a violent actor in her own right. And so I use that arc to think about and talk about what's happened in the 30 years in between that might have mobilized more women to action, including over social media, including through QAnon mobilization, through QAnon moms, and how that has enabled some of these harms. So I want to wrap up with a question about what does it look like to address this? So one, I think it's really important to recognize misogyny both as a fire starter to some of this. I mean, the fact that over half of mass shootings in the US, one of the targets of the mass shooting is a lover or partner or spouse is really important to understand, but also to understand how these things intersect. And so one of the things that I talk about in the conclusion was when I spoke to a funder about the work, he asked what I was working on now, and I said, I'm writing a book on misogyny, and he said, misogyny, but that doesn't have anything to do with white supremacist extremism, which is what I had previously written on. And he said, it's not as if these guys want to eliminate all women from the face of the earth. And that was really interesting to me because it made me realize that I had some work to do, and I tried to do it in the conclusion to really articulate what does it look like to have not just elimination as the bar by which we understand forms of hate, but also suppression, exploitation, insisting on submissiveness, on removal of rights, that those are all parts of the same story, and that these types of things mobilize and underpin other types of racist movements as well. So they're intersectional in ways that have to be attended to. I also talk a lot in this chapter about solutions, including what does it look like to model healthier forms of masculinity as a guard against some of the influencers online. There is a burgeoning field of men's wellness that I'm happy to talk about that has been the most surprising outcome of the book to me, is how much I've been embraced by the men's wellness movement. I've given at least a dozen different talks and conversations in bookstores and in public events with young men and older men who work in those movements, who are trying to transform and work through schools in their programs and NGOs to change this outcome. And I think there's now in Maryland, in California, and also in Canada, a national strategy. There are several state strategies now on men and boys to try to address some of these outcomes and vulnerabilities for men and boys. We have a guide out with the Southern Poverty Law Center on this called Not Just a Joke, Understanding and Preventing Gender and Sexuality-Based Bigotry. Princeton University Press let me put a abridged version of the guide in the back of the book. So we were co-writing the guide as a team in the lab and with Southern Poverty Law Center writers as I was writing the book. So they're well aligned and really give a lot of resources to parents, teachers, mental health counselors, and others about what these harms look like and where you can go to get more resources. Ways to talk to kids about it that involve curiosity rather than judgment, that try to put kids in the position of expert to tell you about their online lives. I'm going to skip that one for now and just wrap up so that we have time for questions and say that our tools, for anyone who's interested in, are free to everyone. They're available on our community-facing website, not the university-based website. We are allowed to have a community-facing one so that we can more quickly upload tools and guides and evidence ourselves. We have a new division. It's not so new now, almost 16 months old. After I turned in the book, we launched a division on preventing gendered violence that is studying and investigating and developing tools for these in several different countries, Jordan, Kenya, Canada, and the US. And ultimately, what I argue in the book, because I spend most of my time on prevention, is that the prevention of mass violence across the board will only work across ideologies if we also understand the gender dimensions of violence itself, including in its everyday and interpersonal ways, as foundational to these bigger forms of violence that we pay attention to on the national security side. So I will stop there and take questions. I know I talk fast.
Thank you so much for really enlightening information and a contextualization. So happy to have you in this sphere. We do have some questions already in the chat, and if others have questions, just please submit them through the Q&A. Sherwood Smith asks, how does the ethnic/race of women show up in your research?
Yeah, so it's a good question. So in the lab, I will say we have a partnership with Howard University on our on a tool now for higher ed that is specifically looking at what's called the Black Manosphere. And we also have this international project funded by the Christchurch Call Foundation that has research going on in Kenya and Jordan. So I would say it's ethnic, race, and linguistic religious issues come out there as well. And you know, the the overall themes are not any different. There's just a slight difference on in the case of the so-called Black Manosphere, where the target of a lot of the anger is directed toward Black women, and the grievances are very focused on Black women having ruined communities, or all, there's a lot of false grievances and false claims that are being made that are more specific, but the overall type of misogynistic policing is not any different. In Jordan and Kenya, that code booking that we've done, the mapping of online grievances, we're just now beginning the focus groups, so I can't really say anything about those yet. But the grievances are um, the main difference is the that they sit within somewhat more mainstream patriarchal norms in society, and so there's some justification that is a little bit different than you see in the US or Canada and those places where we're doing focus groups. But again, it's not really that different. It's just justified differently. So that's the main way so far I would say it's showing up.
Great, thank you. We have many questions in here that we will not get to. Um, Another one, misogyny in the form of Andrew Tate and Boko Haram, et cetera, are obvious, but what do we do when so-called allies are perpetrators, as we've seen in the news lately?
Yeah, so upsetting to see Cesar Chavez, to see like just to see people who are uh doing work that where it seems a little less expected than someone who's deliberately trying to profit off of it or trying to sell a package of exploitation or harm. I mean, this gets back to the way we talk in the lab about our approach to preventing violence is called a public health approach, which means we work very upstream to create to reduce what are called the risks and enhance protective factors. Those include all kinds of things like addressing loneliness, but also building digital media literacy. And I think this is where and the advantage of an approach like that is that it actually is pre-ideology, right? Like it means building community cohesion and safety for everybody, and not going at the counter narrative arguments that people have tried to use in the preventing terrorism field for many, many years. Like, let's just provide accurate information about Islam. Well, that did not work, right? Like, there was a long effort to do that kind of stuff. So my argument would be that's all the more reason, like, yes, certain ideologies have misogyny and the control of women and exploitation of women more openly baked into their approaches, but it only works so well because it's so embedded in mainstream. And so that's the chapter on containment really tries to show that some of this is just subconscious. I don't think any of those people who sent me hate messages around, that were trying to keep me in my place were consciously aware that that's what they were doing. They were angry that I was front and center, but they don't necessarily know why they're angry. They're angry because it goes against what they thought was a gendered norm or expectation that I should not be front and center. And I think that's the same type of thing that can underpin exploitation from someone on the left. And so I think that it shows the importance of engaging in these things much earlier and engaging in, you know, lots of conversations in schools around consent, but also respect and pleasure. I mean, this gets into the data on violent porn's effect on choking behaviors, for example, which I'm sure has come up in medical schools as well. That's a big debate about how sex education is taught in schools and whether it's okay to talk about that kind of thing. But I think I know one school in DC did a parent porn summit to talk about those things. So that's not about ideology. That's about violent behaviors increasing in ways that are provably having outcomes on stroke rates, for example, or other types of harmful outcomes among women. So I think the best thing to do is address it earlier for everybody. And and address it as a systematic part within the national security space on the violent side. But really, these things start much earlier.
And I think to build on that or push that further, here's another question about, can you share some of the organizations, big actors, and themes you're seeing in the men's wellness movement? And
Yeah.
is there any data to suggest signs of hope?
Yeah, so this is a great question, and it's a super controversial question, I would say, which you might not realize is controversial because there's still a lot of tension. I often find there's still people in the field who see this as a zero-sum game, and so I think it's really important to try not to see it as a zero-sum game. That the men's wellness work has to be situated within the context of gender equity and on acknowledgement of the harms, but also that it's important to acknowledge that women do still bear the brunt of the violence, that anti-LGBTQ violence is still, I mean, it affects everyone in ways that it's not just about men's needs. And I think I've heard a lot of frustration from feminists and feminist activists about it. So I want to acknowledge that and say that's something I've spent a lot of time talking about on as I've been more included in some of these conversations with men's wellness groups. The one I like the best right now is Movember. So highly recommend looking at Movember. They were originally you might know them as the Mustache Group because originally they were around prostate cancer awareness. It really was a men's health initiative. And then they got a huge influx of money from a donor and became a much bigger men's wellness and men's health and wellness initiative. They have offices now in the US, Canada, Germany, the UK, elsewhere. They're originally Australian. And they're just doing really thoughtful and good work on fatherhood, on you know, men's and boys' mental health as it affects these trajectories toward misogyny in the manosphere. And so I really like a lot of their initiatives. They also do a lot of online work in gaming spaces and esports. Um, I also really like a group called Next Gen Men, which is in Canada. That's a very upstream group. They start with mental health and they do work on gaming servers like Discord and really good at reaching 13, 14-year-old boys and on mental health needs and on reducing homophobic bullying kinds of conversations in those servers. And then they use that trust to build toward healthy relationship conversations, to build toward gender equity conversations and online harms and things like synthetic media use and nude undressing apps. But they build the trust first around mental health in servers that are around gaming. And so they've had some really good success. Um, and then I really like this spreading initiative for older men called Walking Talking Men. There's a chapter in New York. I know there's a couple chapters out in California and probably elsewhere that is really trying to break some of the stoicism and lack of friendships that solidify starting, in the research shows starts in early adolescence, but really continues to get worse and worse for men, and that provably lead to worse outcomes on health and longevity as they don't ask for help, they don't have connection, they're much more isolated, particularly if they lose a spouse or a partner. And so they just meet like in Central Park and walk and talk. And the idea is to kind of break men out of some of that. So I've heard from a bunch of men who run those and have talked to men who are in those groups. And they, for me, it's like you see women in my neighborhood walking and talking all the time. You almost never see men walking with each other and talking. And so it's a visible difference in, unless men are walking a dog, they're usually not walking or they're walking with a partner. But women, clusters of women, moms in the neighborhood, neighbors go walking and catch up with each other and kind of support each other in their lives. And I think that's um, it's just a simple initiative, what we call a shoulder to shoulder intervention that is trying to break some of those norms, some of that what they call the man box culture that has kept men, many of them, in a kind of stoicism, dominance, aggression, as hallmarks of masculinity type of box. So those are the three I would recommend. But there are others, lots of others.
I'm going to have one more question. I just need a minute at the end to give my goodbye. But so we're at a College of Medicine. So what specifically can healthcare professionals and medical education professionals do to be a part of a more
Yeah.
hopeful future?
Oh, such a good question. So I think, to This is a really good question that I don't really know the answer about how medical professionals interact with public health professionals, but I would say, to any extent that there can be, I think it's the same way that I would hope that public health professionals have helped change the incidence of disease like cardiac disease or diabetes by intervening decades up the road. It's really helpful to think about intervening much earlier in trajectories toward violence. And so I think that health professionals can be one thing is training medical professionals who might also go into mental health psychiatric specialties or other specialties where you might end up in assessment roles in clinical places where you might have to assess young men who increasingly are being sent, like the Buffalo shooter, to psychiatric evaluation based on something that happened in the school. But then, those experts need trainings. We need more mental health and psychiatric training for people who get referrals from social services in general. And I think the overall emphasis on well-being, to whatever extent, I know there's a lot of pressure in medical schools and medical professions on, how much time you get to spend with patients, but the isolation of adolescents and the trajectories that lead toward these inequitable outcomes that are also affecting democratic cohesion, with beliefs about women's right to vote, for example, or things like that, I think are a place that medical professionals can really be on the front line. So I think anywhere, we also find that for faith leaders, like anybody who interacts with the public on a regular basis can be better equipped to recognize warning signs and make referrals on how to get intervened. And that's something that we'd be happy to help with. We have a lot of resources and trainings that we can provide, including trainings that are free through the Lumina Foundation to public universities. So happy to do those.
Thank you so much, Dr. Cynthia Miller-Idriss, for being with us. And it's great that we can do this in a virtual format so we can bring you from Washington, D.C. to Burlington, Vermont. And even though it seems easy, sometimes I have to recognize the staff in my office, Tiffany Delaney, who is our director, and Noah Burns and Olive Gallmeyer, who bring these events to life, as well as Margaret Tando, our Associate Dean for Inclusive Excellence, and Dean Page, the Dean of our college, who supports this. There is a post-lecture guide that's available. There's a link in the chat right now. There's also CMIE credit that's available. Again, links in the chat. Olive Gallmeyer will be sending out these links as well to anyone whose email is associated with their identity here. And so you can claim that afterwards. We will be back in the fall for additional events, so stay tuned. And Cynthia, thank you again for bringing us a real meaty evidence-based talk, but that offers us a path forward. So thank you
Thank
so
you.
much,
Thank you
and
so much.
have a great afternoon, everyone. Take care.